Well, it's 10 o'clock in the morning still in Minneapolis, right?
Yes.
So you haven't physically moved
No, but
in
you
that
have.
context. I have. I've only moved 3 or 4 hours, depending on whether you got summertime included or not.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. Was it's not as
Yeah,
early in
but
the. I mean, it's
but
earlier in the day for you now than it was previously.
yeah. So it's daylight now as opposed to black.
Yeah.
The other thing, of course, is further north.
Oh, okay. So even more light.
So I get summertime more light, but in winter you get less.
Yes. Yes.
And
I've noticed that
what?
about the difference between. I'm at about 45 degrees here in Minnesota, or at least I was when I was up north. Maybe a little bit south of that now. But where I'm moving to in California, although it's Northern California, it's still quite a bit lower. So I'll get
Yeah,
much more even
yeah.
illumination year round, I guess.
Well, this is having moved around a bit, and occasionally you sort of rather like people have this problem of how did
Hey, Will,
Morning.
Tim was saying something, but now he's frozen.
Uh-oh.
I don't know if you coming in blocked him out or what happened.
I'm a disruptor.
It's a good thing to be. I'm wearing my disruptor t-shirt.
I like it. I like it. I like it.
So
Is it beautiful in Wisconsin? Whatever the hell it is.
St. Paul, yeah, it is actually. It was even more so yesterday. It was in the 80s. Today, I think it's going to the mid 70s. It's already reaching about 70. So
It's like, yeah, it just turned 75 here, and it was chilly yesterday, and it's going to be in the 80s tomorrow. So,
yeah.
um,
Long
all right,
bike
how's the
ride.
weather in England, Tim? Are you in England again? And you're muted.
Oh yeah, you came back on muted, Tim.
it's cold and wet.
Cold and wet.
Wow.
That's the way it's
Yeah,
supposed to be,
so this is the other problem is I've had nigh on 20 years of climate. Now I have weather.
right?
So um, I've had a wander around to the library in town to one of the um, supermarkets. So I've done about 4,000 steps today, and I've been hot, cold, dry, and wet, and that's between the library and the supermarket.
So you've had the whole experience.
Yeah. So it's the same thing as they say about Scotland and Ireland: is wait 5 minutes, it'll change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
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 They say that about New England where I
Um,
work, but I think it's probably a little bit less true in New England than it is in the UK.
Yeah.
it's the maritime climate that does it.
Yeah.
That's not particularly oceanic in terms of like California.
Mm-hmm.
But I was going to say before I got dropped out, going east-west, I don't find a major problem. What is more of a problem is going north-south, such that I left the UK one evening to go to Oslo, and it's like a 2-hour, 3-hour flight, if that. But it was a bad flight, bad meal, and the hotel wasn't expecting me.
No.
It was a conference hotel, so the kitchen had closed. They didn't do room service. So my dinner that night was a packet of licorice all sorts and a packet of crisps. So I was pretty grumpy.
Yeah.
But I had no idea who I'm meeting or where I'm going tomorrow, but I'm being picked up. And it's like, okay, I can't miss the pickup. So set my mobile phone, stick it under my pillow, and go to sleep. And the other quirk of this hotel is it's on top of the hill. Well, on top of a mountain, round the edge of Oslo. And so I look out my bedroom window, which is 4 floors down, because that's the other thing. You go in the lobby at ground floor, and the hotel goes down the mountainside.
Hmm,
Oh,
that sounds interesting.
So you look out my window, and I'm looking right at the top of the Olympic ski jump. So I've gone to sleep, and I know full well it's not going to be a good night. It's fitful sleep. But because I'm, like 4 miles out of town, as it were, up on the hillside, curtains are open, but I haven't quite clocked which way is which yet. Turns out I'm facing east, good as. And as you do, strange bed, strange room, all the rest of it, and didn't eat well, and was grumpy. I sort of woke up at one point and thought, shit, bright blue sky, jumped out of bed, flew off towards the bathroom, past the television, and there's a little clock. 3:20 in the morning. It's midsummer, right? And so Oslo gets something like 18 hours of daylight
Right.
because it's that further north. And I hadn't quite adjusted. Oddly enough, almost every time I went back, it was January or February. So it was like the reverse.
Yeah.
So you get up in the dark, you go to bed in the dark, you have breakfast in the dark, and if you're lucky, cup of coffee number 3 is after sunrise, but not much.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess it was 2 years ago. Last May, I went to Austria. The year before, I went to Iceland. And it was late May. It was right after the end of the semester. And so about 2 years, about exactly 2 years in the past. And it was already midnight sun. It wasn't sun, but it was midnight light. So it just never got dark. It got foggy and and crazy outside. But luckily, the hotel rooms had blackout curtains. But it was, and I imagine although they do, some people rave about going and seeing the holiday lights. I don't know that I could stand the constant dark. I used to dislike it just quite enough, going to work in the dark and coming home in the dark in Minnesota. So I can't even imagine what that would be like otherwise. So anyways, we're probably all here now. So hello. Hi, everybody. This is my last book club meeting in St. Paul in this apartment. I'm almost entirely packed. I will be probably tomorrow, after I make the video out of this meeting, I'll probably be packing my computer and then just working off my notebook for a couple weeks. So then I'll be really good to go. Pack the last couple of pans in my kitchen, and that's it.
So given we were talking about time zones, etc., we
yep.
Oh, you locked up again. I'm anticipating you're going to say, are we going to change the meeting date or the meeting time? And my answer to that is going to be no, because Chris already comes at 8, so I can grab my coffee and come at 8.
And sometimes Mark comes at whatever time Hawaii is.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Yep. So I mean, hopefully, I don't know, maybe Tim's going to have to log out and in again, but
I mean,
we'll catch up with that.
And we had some crazy guy who was dialing in from, the Middle East for a long time.
Right. I know. So Tim, I'm assuming you were going to ask if the meeting time was going to remain the same. And so you locked up, but I answered that question in anticipation. And yeah, I think that, since Chris comes in at 8 o'clock California time, I can certainly do that too.
I mean, for myself on the East Coast, I wouldn't mind this starting later if it's easier for people, but
I kind of like starting my Saturday with this, and then and even now at 10 o'clock, I'm done by noon, and I have the rest of the day in St. Paul, and I think that'll only be more so. And
this is a good time for me. I'm just saying, if it's getting to be an issue, I don't mind going later.
Well, but Dan, you're an early riser. I mean, I see posts from you earlier in the day than 10. So
Yeah, I tend to.
when I'm up, so
Yeah.
go figure.
Yeah, I tend to. I wouldn't say I don't. I wouldn't say I don't sleep well, but especially right now as it's getting to this, this move, and there's, I'm very excited about it. So I'm finding myself more awake than I might otherwise be at odd times in the middle of the night. And sometimes I just get up in the middle of the night and do some work for a couple hours, and and then hit the hay again. So, anyways, yeah. So I'm planning on the movers are coming Wednesday, hopefully Wednesday morning, and loading out the apartment. And I imagine, if there's half a dozen guys, it'll take them about 10 minutes. And then if they are coming early enough and it's enough time for me to drive up north, then I will drive up north on Wednesday. If not, I'll drive up north on Thursday morning, and then I've got a couple of days that I'm planning on spending with my son, and then a day with my daughter in in the Fargo area. And then I'll be hitting the road. So it's all kind of coming down. I finally finished. I thought I had finished my semester yesterday, but of course, after I closed the grades, I got a couple of panicked emails from students saying, I didn't know. Like, how didn't you know? How many announcements did I put in the learning management system? How many times did I reiterate when the term paper was due?
Well, and if they're running late, don't they just put it in their work AI? And I mean, I found your essay on that interesting.
What was your opinion on that?
Well, so I thought I would have been as generous, I think, but I would have been concerned, and this is my own hang-up set, about what is the official university or college policy on this, and am I contravening that out of my generosity?
I've been following that fairly closely, and
I think colleges are struggling to keep up. Is my
they
take.
don't have, yeah, they I mean, they've been griping about it for the last couple of years, really,
Right.
but they don't really have a policy yet. In the same way that they don't about, they've got a kind of a set of guidelines about plagiarism and all that
Which
kind of
this
stuff.
is not.
Which this is not, but it's kind of adjacent. It's
Or
the
is
same,
this paid? I mean, is it a paid essay writing thing? One could argue, which would be, submitting someone else's work as your own.
Right.
It's
Yeah, I
not,
don't
not
think this was. I
necessarily
don't think this
plagiarism,
was.
but like a ghosted essay.
Right. I don't think this was a human created essay at all. I think it was, it had
But
all the hallmarks of.
that's true. AIs can't hold copyright, so this couldn't count
Right.
as that.
Yeah.
But it also occurred to me that, if I was reading that and someone cited the Abigail Adams letter and says, I realize this is not part of the primary sources that we use, but I think it illustrates my point.
Yes.
That would have been great.
That would have been engagement. That would have proven some engagement.
Right.
Yes. Or if they had said, these are the ones from the, I mean, they had a lot to choose from. We read, the way that this course worked, there were over 200 primary sources. Now
So you had a good set.
Condensed them. It was a decent sized set, and so I had condensed them down to less than 1,500 words each, and I had read them aloud. So there was an audio file along with each one where they could listen along as they were annotating or reading it. So it was as easy as could be. I mean, given that they had to engage. That was all they had to do was kind of engage, and so that was the thing. Yeah, this young woman who actually kind of fessed up to it, I was proud of her, I guess, for kind of fessing up to it, and AI is new enough that if she's using it at work and has
And
come
probably
to
being encouraged and in fact
Yeah.
mandated.
Right.
I mean, I will say in my workplace, we're being told if you're not using it every day, you're not contributing.
Right, exactly.
Really?
So that would certainly give you a different message and a different mindset about its utility and its validity. But the things actually that really the things that annoy me even more than that are, just sort of this kind of sense of entitlement,
Yeah.
that kind of says, oh, I don't have to pay attention to the frequent and repeated announcements of when things are due and what the requirements of the paper are, and that sort of thing. And then when they don't get the grade that they believe that they deserve just because of who they are, then it's my problem.
Right.
So I guess that
Well,
was.
yeah. I think I can't remember if I've told you this before. My father was a professor as well, and much of the time he taught what was called the core curriculum, the core at in the biology biochemistry department,
Mhm.
which was students who were dead set on going into medicine or
Right.
higher degree academics, and those students he loved and they were engaged and they didn't seem to shirk. But then once in a while we'd have to teach the survey courses, which is a little bit more like what you're teaching, and then it was just like it was for him very dispiriting because of the dichotomy between the two, right? These were kids that was like, I just need to get my good grade,
Mhm. Yeah.
not I want to get the good learning.
Right, right. Well, and I don't mind I mean, I used to, when I was at the university, I used to teach not that many history majors, but a lot of social studies ed majors. So they were preparing for, to
For
use
further work.
the content professionally. And now I'm teaching, yeah, like you said, mostly surveys for non-majors, which doesn't really bother me because
Which
I
but as a
like.
student, if I got engaged by that, I loved it.
Yeah, yeah. I like the idea of sort of kind of bringing people who are not going to be historians or anywhere even near historians, bringing them some insight about, kind of how we got to where we are, and something that they can use to sort of flesh out their understanding of kind of the current world situation, which
But also how
otherwise
to
I
think about
imagine
what
they're
they're
going to
told.
get by way of YouTube or something
Yeah.
else.
But also how to think about what they're being told, right? By focusing on primary sources, they anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, and to think a little bit, a little bit more critically about it, and to see that there are. I mean, I try to set up, sort of opposing perspective primary
Right.
sources, adjacent to each other, so that they can see. I mean, even to the extent of, defenses of slavery in the, in the pre-war, in the antebellum last few years, which is, not something that that I'm expecting them to sympathize with, but I am expecting them to kind of engage with it and try to understand, and really try to understand whether they imagine that these people are sincere or not. That's one of the questions I ask. I ask a lot of myself, actually, also when I'm looking, especially at, kind of journalistic and political sources. Is this for real, or is this a reason, or is this a rationale? That sort of thing. But
Well, and
anyways, which kind of brings
to
us to
draw back to
Hoover.
our text, though,
Yes.
I will say,
Yeah.
at the tail end of this section, our author does do some of that in
Oh yeah.
in comparing and contrasting the points of view of the Roosevelts and the Hoovers on the relationship between the two of them through the campaign and towards the end,
Hmm.
which I appreciated, right? Because
Yeah.
it even cites in his footnotes, it's like, well, here's this bit from Eleanor Roosevelt where she sort of backs off one of the things she says, and here's it was, so I appreciated that.
Yeah.
He sure did seem very, very much to be taking overall, though, taking
The
sort of
Hoover side, yes.
side. Yes.
Yes.
I mean, those were okay. I've been talking about, oh, he's such a lightweight, Roosevelt's such a lightweight, and Hoover's doing everything he possibly could. But yeah, eventually we do get, of course, on the other hand, maybe it was a little bit of a misunderstanding,
Yeah.
and
Well,
he
and
seemed
even
actually pretty
before
partisan for
even
Hoover.
before Roosevelt kind of comes into the picture, there's a
Yeah.
lot about, that White is doing a lot about, how Hoover is the most credible authority on economics in general and on the world economy, and which sort of begs the question of, well, then why because once, again and again and again he says, well, and Hoover stood pat, or Hoover was
Hmm.
passive, or Hoover didn't act, so okay, wait a minute.
Well, what
Explain.
struck me in a lot of that discussion, especially leading into the Depression, is how much data they didn't have to know what, and he kept mentioning natural business cycles, which at that time were odder cycles of kind of turn the thing on, turn the thing off, whereas modern business and manufacturing is we try to be lean, we try to be just in time. We do a lot more anticipation, literally to the point that in the tariff story now, the bigger issue is, if you have all these horrible tariffs, is it really going to bring business back in manufacturing back to America, or a corporation is just going to say, hey, it's going to cost so much money to build something in the US. We may as well wait 4 years for the administration to change, policies to change dramatically, and we'll keep doing what we've always done. So it's that planning horizon is much bigger and longer and much more stable now than it was in Hoover's time.
Mhm.
And White, I think, does a fairly good job of reminding us just how bad the data was
Mm.
on unemployment numbers, even. Like, we think the unemployment is this, but we really have no idea. And I think there was one point at least he mentioned that Hoover took kind of the brighter, happier side of the picture that he was getting
Right.
as an
Right. And he
example of that.
prefaces that
But
very
it's
statement by saying something about based on his personality. He kind
right.
of ties it to this psychological judgment that he's made about Hoover's personality, a defensive personality. Typical of a defensive personality. He took this brighter view, kind
Yeah.
of thing. Yeah.
But it's within that frame, and we talked about it a little last week and I think in this section he mentions too the professionalization of government in terms of starting to collect data to have, to kind of, in some sense, run it as a business, or at least have data to back up decisions you're making. Whereas, and I think it was in must have been chapter 20, I think, where he talks about all of these economists who are coming in and looking at, when did the depression really start? Did it start in Europe in 28 or 29 or 30 in various countries, and how the fallout of World War One is affecting it? And 20 economists all have 20 different opinions about what happened, what's going on,
Yeah.
versus here you've got this president who is at least trying to consume the numbers and look at what data he can and make a reasonable decision,
Yeah.
versus, when I keep comparing the situation here with the situation we're in now, and what government looks like and what a sitting Republican president is doing. And given the vast amounts of data we've got, and the kind of, we're back to a president who seems to think spending time on golf courses and hanging out and shooting the breeze is like, oh, and I don't even think you could say he's keeping banker's hours, because he's sunsetting so much that he spends 2 hours a night, tweeting.
Yeah.
But we've gone now back to this, totally non-professional president
Hmm.
within, and it's almost bookended by a century of time.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. And actually, the century of time is relevant too, right? Because I mean, I think White seems to be wanting to sort of denigrate the professional economists a little bit to
Yeah.
sort of build up Hoover, right? Because at one point he says, this dude here is the best, regarded as like the best, you know, American economist ever, and gets it wrong, gets it completely 180 degrees wrong on the duration of the recession and the fact that we're coming out. But also, I mean, as far as the numbers go, I mean, I remember when I was researching Charles Bradlaugh in London in the 1880s, actually early, maybe late 1880s, early 1890s, when he finally became an MP. One of the things that he pushed really, really hard for was a Bureau of Labor Statistics in the UK, because America already had one. right? Because the Americans, before the end of the 19th century, were already collecting a lot of data. Now, and I think, Chris, I mean, to go back to kind of the beginning of what you're saying, the idea that we have more information now, we have more data now, but
Yeah.
we're still arguing about, I mean,
The theories of what it does.
Eric Weinstein and his wife are still mad that they, that Harvard, basically told her no on her new theory, that he collaborated with her on about actually figuring out what the CPI is, and and kind of doubling down on the squishy bullshit version of the consumer price index that would allow them to not, that would allow them to really not reflect the reality
Yeah.
as far as Weinstein and
Yeah,
Pia
and
go.
it comes from outside of this book too, but I remember reading, and it's a fairly pro Greenspan thing, but I remember in kind of Greenspan's remembrances and look back, even in the 80s and 90s, he is personally crunching numbers with, pencil in hand and going through spreadsheets to try and puzzle out what's actually happening
Hmm.
at the ground level to be able to do his job as chair of the Fed
Yeah.
instead of having a team or an army of statisticians looking at that data for him and then helping to inform his perspective. But we've also looked in kind of the depth and breadth of our reading over the last 2 years, you know discussions that the professionalization of the economics field didn't really start happening until after World War II. And the big textbooks that are kind of trying to teach everybody a little bit more about how economics works weren't coming out until 48, 49, 50.
Right. Samuelson's circular
And
flow.
and even then they're still, they're not really great, but so we've built up this myth of economics, and even the professionals at that time, I have to think that Hoover at least was hardworking and thoughtful enough that he's digging in and knows economics at least to the level of the Schumpeter's and the rest of the crowd around him.
Hmm.
Or if not, maybe not as well studied as they are, but at least he's got a grasp of what's going on to a much greater extent than, any other 20 people that you can pull off the street.
Right. I agree. I agree with you and with White on that. And I think, but I also kind of feel like it is that what happened kind of with Schumpeter and with Samuelson and and these guys who sort of then create this I wouldn't say as much professional economics as academic economics, that it becomes that macro actually kind of becomes a thing, because the impression that I get actually is that when Hoover is thinking about international trade and what we would now kind of put within macroeconomics, government and business relationships, and intergovernmental relationships, and balances of trade and currency exchange rates and all that kind of thing, that he's still thinking of it in what I would consider to be kind of a microwave, by which I mean something that you can actually sort of press on and get an effect, right? That you can make, that you can make some type of an intervention. And it seemed like his intervention style was, and White mentions a bunch of times that that when a particular crisis arises, he's relieved because it's, this is something I can recognize, and I can kind of address, and I can put my hands into the puzzle, and move the pieces around and that sort of thing. And so that's the impression that I get of his approach to some of these areas that we would now just sort of automatically assume are part of macro, but but that they were much more amenable to adjustment, and
Yeah.
to actual fine tuning by people, by individuals, because he had not been really a power wielding government official in these appointed positions, right? He had been talking with people. Yes, they were heads of state and and finance ministers and and those types of people, but it was kind of a person to person sort of a thing, and so I think that there's a different feeling
when he was in the commerce. Yeah, he was like the vice president of everything, right? Whatever the term was. I mean, he was, he had to go out of his way to say, "I'm not the dictator of food. I'm the general supervisor of food," or whatever the hell, the admit.
Yeah. I guess.
So is this not where we get the West Wing quote in, as in we've got a president with a Nobel Prize in economics? But seriously, we talk about the macro bit, but then we also talk about CPI. And with some of the things I'm seeing at the moment, is we've also brought it into the current situation, as in we've got so much information. But I think the word that's not been mentioned yet is we don't seem to have much economic wisdom, at least not for the people.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I was thinking on the same lines, we said about, we've got this financial collapse that's worldwide that then leads us into World War II. But to come up with a different answer now, in the sense of we've gutted the middle class, when even with Maggie, when her let's play the Reagan thing and sell off British Telecom and the railways and the water companies and all the rest of it. And they worked very hard to make sure that the banks, particularly, and big people couldn't buy millions and millions of shares. So at the day of making the stuff available for the IPO, I wouldn't mind betting that you probably end up with at least 10%, if not more, maybe even 20% in some instances of the UK owning shares in BT, for instance, or British Gas. The problem comes, of course, is that the true businessman, the true investor, has a much longer planning cycle than a
Oh, you're locked up again. Yes, and he particularly, I'm responding to what Chris put in the chat. He particularly tried to distinguish between the bad recession of 1921 and the not so bad one of 1923. So he was parsing this information, fairly.
So where does I was trying to get to, where does it end when we end up with 5 or 10 emperors seemingly owning 99% of the shares of everything?
Mm-hmm. Well,
and somewhere there was a recent throwaway line from somebody, not in us but elsewhere, that 85+% of all the normally traded shares are held by the top 20 hedge funds.
Yeah, mutual funds or hedge funds. Yeah. And that's been
between hedge fund and mutual fund.
I'm sorry.
Big difference between a mutual fund and a hedge fund. I mean, half
right.
of our
Well, yeah. Yeah, and historically, it seems like it began with the mutual funds, and then it kind of migrated or evolved into being the hedge funds. But yeah, I mean, there's who's the guy who wrote about it'll come to me. The corporate governance mutual funds guy who wrote about the you know the growth of first Fidelity and then Vanguard and these companies, and especially once it got to being index funds, it was an even kind of a different thing, and the effect on corporate governance that created. One of the things that I found kind of ironic along the way, that I thought that White, I was glad that he mentioned it, but I thought he could have gone into some more detail about it, was sort of when the Fed raises the discount rate to try to kind of put the kibosh on margin buying. And it's completely ineffective. It crushes business, right? But it doesn't really hurt the margin buyers, because they were already used to paying 20% rates, and they don't blink about that. But the Fed raises the discount rate to like 5%, and businesses are destroyed, and their ability to kind of borrow is severely compromised. So it's a completely ineffective use of the Fed's power, and kind of a brain dead thing. And that's kind of an interesting story that I thought could have been, I mean, it could have been a book of its own. The idea of sort of the technocracy, and the story of like Hawley and then Smoot as well.
Well, that
Yeah,
gets
those.
actually though to something interesting, or an interesting perspective, and I don't know if it's accurate or not. But White's story here actually, on a lot of things, and it's consistent, is very sort of different from what I have traditionally heard. I think what we've traditionally heard about how the Depression happened, what went on, even little things like, I mean, a little later on, he's talking about, the famous, the bonus march thing, and setting the army on the bonus march. He's talking later about, oh, but that didn't actually have any real effect on Hoover's popularity and reelection, he says, because various things. But I mean, he specifically is talking about, the story I feel like he's telling specifically about the stock market crash,
Yeah.
and the causes of the depression. I mean, I started to get the sense from him that, from his story, that, that the stock market crash really wasn't the cause. He feels like it's almost, he's saying that the stock market crash wasn't the cause of the depression. It just was a thing in there, and there's lots of stuff he doesn't really make it clear what he feels like the cause of the depression is.
I don't think he doesn't take a stated claim, but I think he follows Hoover's
Yes. But Hoover's saying
interpretation.
basically he's not sure what it is. He doesn't know what it is either, really, right?
Well, but
Right.
Hoover does make a case that it's the international.
Sure.
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, Hoover points to multiple things as well. The move from the gold standard, the reparations, and borrowing against the or borrowing to make the reparations, and everything
Yeah.
else.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, and the
There's
bank
also
failures, right, that begin down in, kind of in the South, and then just, kind
So,
of.
But those bank failures weren't. It was like 2 years after the
yeah.
crash, though, wasn't it?
Right.
So
Yes.
it was. And what strikes me is they, and here's again the lack of data that's going on, but the stock market is super overheated, and I think he said it was like 500% of where it was a decade prior.
Yeah. Over
Like
the course of the
people
20s.
are, the word speculation is used heavily in that lead up to the crash. So it's people who have the money who can burn it to throw in are over speculating, and that is a big chunk of what causes the crash. But I get the impression from this, because the crash happens a couple months into his presidency, but the real depression doesn't hit until like 1930, at least in America,
Mhm.
Yeah.
after all of Europe is already in turmoil.
Yeah.
But the decoupling of the stock market with the rest of, because even after that crash, he looks at other things and he calls in, the head of Sears and, all these other big corporations and says, don't, start
GE.
laying people off,
Right.
and I'll give you concessions so that we don't have, I won't let the unions come in and do what they did in the early 20s.
Hmm.
So there's a decoupling between the stock market and the rest of the economy in a way. I think the crash in, 2007, 2008 in America, like, immediately has ripple effects on the rest of the economy in the way that this crash did not a century earlier. So they seem to be decoupled, and all the indicators are that business is still on the rise
Hmm.
for, another year and a half.
Well, see,
And
I think that's where
those
White's
indicators,
wrong.
like, those indicators hit like a peak, and then they start tailing off.
Yeah.
And that's where I think some of the where we have fine-tuned our business cycle now, our business cycle is much more tied to investment in the stock market. So a crash in the market is going to almost instantaneously affect everyone else
Hmm.
Oh, yeah.
now versus
I think
then.
it's sort of half and half though, Chris. I think that what you're saying is kind of what White argued, and I do think that White is channeling Hoover's understanding of this. But I think that that's a mistaken understanding, because I think that the previous bursting of bubbles, like the railroad bubble, was limited really to a sector, and that this is much more broad. That what's happened, I think, since the panics of 1873 and 1893 and even 1907, is that, and maybe 1907 it was beginning to happen, but they were limited to, Jay Gould, blew up, and railroads, went crazy, that sort of thing. But in this one, yeah, it's those guys that he invites. It's Sears, and GE, and and Ford, and these major corporations. And I think that that's the difference, is that now you've got all of these corporations, all of which are being, what's happening in the market this time is that across the board, right, over from 1921, he says, to 1929, it's up 500%. It's primarily up although the economists, and this is where he sort of, also denigrates the economists, is that but he doesn't explain why they're wrong. They're saying that, that the underlying values of these, the fundamentals, as you might say, of these companies are still really, really strong, which is not really true, right? You've got, I mean, the fundamentals underlying a valuation are, the assets on their books, plant and equipment, intellectual property, stocks of natural resources, forward projected revenue, sales, and by no measure were these corporations really worth what the market was valuing them at. The only thing that was driving up the value was the incredible demand that was enabled by people able to buy shares for 10 cents on the dollar. Right? So you get like a 10x increase in demand just based on that availability of credit, of margin credit.
Yeah,
And
again, there's like we also have the countervailing example of Ford, who specifically made a point of paying his workers enough that they could afford to buy that car.
yes,
You
yes,
know, which
yeah,
is so. I
Hmm.
mean, I think there's a difference between the value of the company, in terms of whether or not it can make profits and is an ongoing thing versus the value of the company's stock.
right. Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that these companies were worthless. Some of them were valuable, but I'm saying that their market value was inflated tremendously, even
Hugely,
Ford's,
yes,
by the
yes.
ability of people to go, of retail investors to go into the market and buy these things at, for, I mean, because margin, they were buying them on 80, 90% margin. right? And,
Yeah.
and yes, they were paying, maybe 20%, a 20% vig to these, secondary creditors, but everything was so quickly, they thought moving up and to the right that they would be able to absorb that charge, and pay it out of their profits. And then, of course, the first, when the margin calls begin to come and they're underwater, then it goes south really, really
Yeah. Well, you're also in an era before Graham and Dodd, an actual valuation of companies. And when you have a market that it makes it easy for Joe with his $5 to invest, and Joe has no idea what the hell he's doing, and there's no governmental oversight or help to prevent that kind of overheating, you're in a technological time frame from the early 1910s that yes, technology and industrialization have done and will do great things, but when you overextend the credit markets and speculation to the nth degree,
hmm
you're gonna get into deep water really quickly,
Yeah,
even
Like
if
now.
you have
like
a
now.
bunch of people who are, and we haven't even gotten into this little, dip in the agriculture with the drought
Yeah,
that has
Like
happened,
climate change.
which
right.
Hoover actually is in incredible position to be able to say, "Oh, I I've seen this. I know what the food and agricultural chain looks like,
Right.
and yeah, we can handle this. This is something I can do, and I have expertise in."
Right.
But that happening at the same time as the crash in the beginning of the Depression makes it a whole lot harder to get out of all of this dance.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, we've got so. And again, I'm usually not the guy of like, oh, this is just like it is now. I mean, usually when we talk about, Trump, who I have no use for whatsoever, it's like, let's talk. But yeah, right now we are seeing a huge democratization. Even in the book, they're talking about, oh, great, now everybody, in the 20s, everybody can get into the stock market now,
Right.
as we are now. Hey, great, these amazing companies, they're incredible, and anybody, we've got
Yeah.
that, we've got major climate change thing, and I think there's going to be I think sometime in the next year or so, we're going to have something similar happen, and I'll be paging back to this book to see about all the things that went wrong, and hoping major tariffs suddenly, like Smoot Hawley. Yeah.
well, what is interesting, and White doesn't seem to make an issue here, but you've got this president who really cares and is a hard worker, and he's got all these ideas.
hmm
And I think his one issue is he doesn't seem to know how to deal with the House or the Senate or be a politician.
Yeah.
But he cares deeply, and he's willing to dig in and do the research and try and forge a direction out of doing the work.
hmm
Mm-hmm.
hmm
And I can't help but wonder how much worse this depression would have been had we had a president who was a 9 to 5 banker's hours guy, or a golf course guy, or
Or if it had been
oh, I'm
Harding.
a
Yeah.
horseman and I'm going to spend most of my time doing that, and then this thing hits, and would have how much worse it would have been.
Well, if he'd been an effective delegator, I mean, Harding made actually Hoover was a pretty good Secretary of Commerce. He made a good point of delegating
hmm
that work to Hoover. So yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with the banker's hours issue. You can, I think, there's some presidents who have been really smart about recognizing they are not necessarily the smartest guy in the room. They want, your whole,
Right. Maybe I shouldn't have said
tower
Harding.
of
I should have said
rivals.
Coolidge.
Yeah. But
But
regardless, Harding or Coolidge, or Wilson, who's spending most of his time chasing around this woman who eventually, this high school or whatever, not
right.
high school. I'm overspeeding, but yeah, I mean, a president who is not doing actual harm.
Yeah.
A president who's actually saying, okay, let's actually pick smart people and I'll let them do their work.
Right.
I'd be okay with that, but
Well, I do think it's interesting that we've got this idea of, that White chapters ago had sort of portrayed Hoover's approach to the presidency as he would rather have been appointed to it than have to run for election, right? So an appointed an appointed guy, one of those people that a politician would entrust, as an expert with these types of decisions and actions, doesn't really need to respond, doesn't need to be responsible to the constituency in kind of the same way, right? And doesn't need to really, maybe the main thing is, doesn't need to really communicate with the constituency and kind of bring them along and explain to them, although I have been impressed kind of throughout this that Hoover has been more of a media guy, and he has been sort of making speeches, he has been getting on the radio and doing those types of things that I had always sort of naturally kind of attributed to FDR, right?
Yeah.
Doing the
That's
fireside
true,
chats
yeah.
and getting on the radio and
But
becoming the radio president.
but my take on that is it feels like he comes to that late.
Mhm.
Like it sort of is, uh, you know, he doesn't engage well with the rest of the political bodies of the government.
Right. He's not
And
a digital native.
until the very end, at
Yeah.
least in White's telling,
Yeah.
where it's like, well, okay, I guess I better figure out how to work with the House and Senate, who are,
Mhm.
and working both sides of the House and Senate, right? Working the radicals and the Democrats,
Mhm.
And working the public.
and working the
Well,
public. Yeah, right.
That
Yeah.
does
But
seem to
not
be
until late.
that does seem to be something that White kind of underlines, though, especially in the Smoot-Hawley business, is everyone seems to be out for themselves, and there doesn't seem to be a clear faction of right or left or center or
Yes.
anything. Like, half of the Republicans are going in 10 different directions because they're worried about tariffs for their own manufacturing individual pieces of pie rather than what is good for all of us.
Mhm.
And
And
the number of times he used the word log rolling, I thought was just
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
but
And there's
isn't that maybe I think I'm probably overstating this, but I think that was much more common pre-Newt
Oh
in
yeah.
U.S. politics.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and I think he mentions that, kind of, well, the legislators, that Hoover doesn't understand that the legislators' world looks different, right?
Right. It's very small. It's their
Focused on, yeah, they're
constituencies.
focused on local issues. They're responsible, to their actual constituents for something that their constituents are expecting of them. They don't have, and especially that idea that they don't have a bully pulpit that the president, just kind of automatically has and kind of takes for granted. So this world that they're inhabiting is really kind of completely different.
He could have vetoed it though. And that's the thing. And also that's the thing that we briefly get in here is, he says, okay, at least in White's telling, this was actually sort of his,
Well, it
his
had the
big effort.
agricultural thing and it had the incremental tariff in it, right?
He was going to do, but that was his push.
Yeah.
And veto or not, he could have actually, he could have vetoed it, or he could have just come out publicly against it. But he's like, I don't want to. It was my initiative. I don't want to submarine it. I don't want to kill it.
Mhm.
But he could have stopped it. So he's got his own political, and they were specifically political reasons for. I hold him responsible. That he could have killed this. Yeah. So he didn't do his job of stopping. He was supposed to be the guy who looks at the overall larger thing. Particularly on the economic end, he could have killed this. It was his idea, but he could have killed it either indirectly by coming out publicly against it, or just actually vetoing it. I don't think his veto. I mean, we didn't get the numbers, but I don't see his veto necessarily being overridden at that point. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty high bar.
High bar, yeah.
Yeah.
And at least it would have really identified what was pushing that through,
and also and then again we get a little sort of white. That's another one of the things, by the way, that white poo-poos a little as okay, it really wasn't Smoot-Hawley that was a major contributor to the Depression either. Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Right. Yeah. Which I'm not
disagree
sure
with. I hope
I'm going there. I'm not sure I'm going there with him. One of the things I did find interesting was that he does bring up this idea that, well, wait a minute, this was the guy who saved the children of Europe and the Belgians and the Eastern Europeans. Why the hell won't he raise a finger to save American children?
There were a couple of places where I keep writing children in the margin, probably because of Will's focus on, chapter one,
Mhm.
which I think was still the greatest thing that he only read that one chapter of the six at the time that he did, because it's now
section
had
one, not chapter one.
but it's created this thing that I keep seeing he's doing these things for the kids all the time.
Mhm.
But it kind of throws me off because there was a point I was going to and now I've lost it. But thank you, Will, again for focusing on the children. I think that one of the other things that I do remember, it's not even one of the things that, and maybe it's now a bigger thing for presidents in the modern age, but typically when you go into office, you may name 10 things that you want to work on, but really you may, if you're lucky, you'll get two or three things done.
Mhm.
And what seems weird to me is there doesn't seem, or at least in White's recounting of it, there doesn't seem to be like hey, I'm going to work on these three things to make America better or improve what we've got.
Mhm.
And the fact that it seems like the first half of his term is all Smoot-Hawley and tariffs as like, this is the thing we're going to do. Like, as you know, this is the important thing and let's do this.
But
Doesn't
isn't
seem to exist, but that's what they're working on. So it's kind of like, and as they're getting towards whether he should sign it or not, he's looking back like, oh, I've been for most of these things and I've generally gotten the things I said I wanted, so I have to sign the bill as a political move
Mhm.
on a process that he very generally was hands off on. Like,
He seemed to have a sense that he was worried about losing congressional control in the midterms, and he seems to have believed that the the midterm prospects of a lot of the Republican members of Congress depended on the tariff.
yeah, but I was kind of like, is this really the key thing you want out of your 4 years in office?
Mhm.
And even now, like, the vast American populace probably could not tell you that Hoover was president during
Yeah.
Smoot-Hawley. But the only reason anybody would even know these two congressmen in this law is because of Ferris Bueller's Day Off more than any other thing on the planet. Um, I said the words to out loud this week, and my daughter heard. And she's like, "Oh, that's the Ferris Bueller thing, right?"
That's funny.
And she has,
I didn't know that.
her as 15-year-old freshman in high school, her experience in U.S. history is,
Mhm.
a big goose egg.
Right.
So and why is she watching a 40-year-old movie?
Because she has a smart dad who knows that if you're going to
Exposed her to
understand
the
American
classics.
cultural references, you got to watch Back to the Future and you got to watch.
Bueller, anything? Well, one of the things that was
Well,
interesting was Abraham Lincoln.
mhm.
Kind of keeps making an appearance, and so I guess, Chris, the one thing that I would say to the tariff thing is the tariffs were so ubiquitous. And White does at one point say, well,
Yeah.
this was just a slightly higher tariff than the previous kind of relatively high tariff,
Yeah.
so, and which kind of made a space for me to imagine that Hoover is not thinking that the tariff is the thing that he wants to do in his first 2 years, but that retaining, the party retaining control, legislative control,
Yeah.
and especially, and he discounts the Senate, but especially in the House, is the thing that he wants to accomplish in the first 2 years, and not
Well,
have
I
that
did have
bounce
to
back to the,
I did have to go back and look at when federal income tax became a thing. And I reminded myself it was 1913. And because of that in general taxation policy and how the US government works, it's important to remember where the funding to run the government is coming from
yes,
at this time. So
yeah,
so the tariff thing is, an important piece, although he does mention too that you need a better you need better control of that tariff timeline. You can't run it on a running it trying to run it on a 10-year cycle. If something happens in year 3 or 4 or 5 and you need to finally tune it, you can't rely on Congress,
right,
which is going to be just a mess, to try and shift it when you need to shift it potentially on a dime. But you also, we now know, no, you can't just give a president unilateral, hey, let's just tariff the hell out of everything, because that by itself will also fuck up the economy.
right, right. But it's interesting that the yeah, I mean, it's been decades since there has been an income tax, but tariffs are still an important source of revenue. But the thing that White really seems to want to kind of discount and push sort of almost out of the frame entirely is Andrew Mellon. Because Mellon, was in charge of tax enforcement, and he didn't enforce taxes, especially not on people like himself and his cronies. And so, and that would have been, and the majority of Americans, who had incomes under $4,000 weren't paying any income tax at all, right? So it's really kind of a wealthy person income tax, an industrialist income tax, and it's not being very effectively enforced at all during Mellon. And Mellon's in there till
And
1930.
goes of now again.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, so that's one of the real similarities between that Gilded Age and this one.
There's
Well, of
there's a
course,
quick. Go ahead.
well,
Go
of
ahead.
course, here, the now again, by the time we meet again, I might have a new leader
Oh yeah.
Oh
in
yeah,
the sense of, well, if Starmer gets pushed out, it doesn't force a general election, and whoever replaces him as Labour leader will take over the seat, at least in the short term. There will be a lot of encouragement to, you don't have a man. So we might have a general come October, November, but literally, I don't know what the duration is anymore on the Labour Party getting a new leader. We had so many Conservatives roll over that's like 4 weeks or 3 weeks.
huh.
But I don't know what the Labour one is.
Interesting.
I mean, another sort of thing that I think we get out of this, though, is, and back to your appointed thing, is that idea of, I mean, I think the sort of almost the tragedy, or one of the tragedies of Hoover, is he wasn't good at politics. He didn't want to do politics, but his sort of signature, one of the things that screwed him up the most was he was spending all this time trying to make sure that his party got reelected.
Mm-hmm.
That when he tried to do politics, which he wasn't good at, instead of that seemed, and like you said, we were talking about how it seems like he wants to, he doesn't know what he wants to do other than make sure that his party is still in control.
Yeah. Well,
Which is sort
which
of
seems
the
kind of
opposite of him.
incongruous because the party wasn't all
Yeah.
that good. I mean, it's almost like a Trump 2015, 2016 thing. That the party didn't love him.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he didn't seem, or at least White paints him as a Republican in name, but he really half of his policies, and perhaps it was just politics of the time, that the it's all center and not factions on the edges, which is what we see now. It's everybody's fighting from the edges towards the middle
Right.
rather
Or even
than
in his
this
mind,
is all the
progressive.
middle, but the middle is like a few people here and a few people here, and he's probably somewhere in the center without a clear, like, what does a party need to be at this time?
Mhm.
And well, also you've got a very different electorate in terms of labor participation back then. And I don't have the numbers, but I'm sure the historians here do. I mean, the farm vote was really important.
Mhm.
And but at that point, before the Green Revolution or whatever we want to call it, and vast mechanization, that's what I don't think it's like a significant proportion of
Oh,
the
yeah, yeah,
voting population are people who work on farms.
yeah.
Now
It's
it's like single digits.
right. As an occupational category, it was less than 50%, but it was close to 50%.
Yeah, and what he's pushing for with this, again, the big point of the tariff bill was officially actually an agriculture bill.
Sure.
It's just they also are going to put things in there. So it's it is a much more we actually do have an interest group here.
Mhm.
And it's an interest group that maybe does sort of transcend party lines to a certain extent. You've got Republican farmers and Democratic farmers, I think.
Right. Well,
Um,
and then we haven't even talked about the Dust Bowl, right?
yeah,
So,
Yeah.
so
Well,
we don't, I guess, until like 20 chapters 26 or 27 or something like that. We will get to it, but
even to go back though, in 1900, if I recall properly, 99% of the people on the planet, more or less, are subsistence farming, is really what everyone's doing on the entire planet. And since 1900 to this point, US is definitely in the industrialization game. So a bunch of people have moved out of farming, but still farming and raising your own food is, how the majority of people are getting, a lot of their day-to-day sustenance
mhm,
versus,
yeah, I think it's around
working.
19,
You're not going to the A&P yet at this point to
I
get
think it's not
everything you
until
need.
about 1920 that more than 50% of Americans live in cities.
Yeah.
But by this time, it has happened, right? But the other thing that happened, that White doesn't talk enough about, I think, from an agricultural perspective, is that during the First World War, American farmers had been making bank, right? They had been shipping grain to war-torn Europe, right, where there was no agriculture for the duration, and that and so demand was huge, prices were great. They brought a bunch, and that's kind of one of the catalysts of the Dust Bowl too, right? They brought all of this kind of marginal land that had been grazing land, right? That had been range or pasture into production, and a lot of it will be kind of west of 100 degrees of longitude, and that will become the Dust Bowl. But even so, even without that, this idea, I mean, we think about the Reagan era as the kind of the fence row to fence row agriculture imperative, but the same thing is sort of going on here, right? Everybody is increasing production because there's a bottomless market for it in Europe, and then that is eliminated, and that's kind of what precipitates the agricultural recession or depression that begins in 1921, and that never really 100% goes away. I mean, it never gets as good as it was, in World War One for American farmers until World War Two.
Yeah. And you got to pull back from, well, and yeah, he even mentions too that most of Europe is still overproducing weapons and ships
Hmm.
as if they're still at war.
Yeah.
and that's a piece of what's happening to the economy. And you're kind of overproducing for something that doesn't exist.
Right. Right.
He only touches on it for like a paragraph, though, that piece of it. But I have to wonder, is that a bigger piece of the economic puzzle that we just don't see because they're not data? The one thing I think I would fault White for is it's too much a um, straight biography of Hoover, and it would have been nice if he had more expertise in economics.
Hmm.
And if I remember, he's a publisher by trade,
Hmm.
but having more economics expertise, particularly now that this thing's been 100 years, so we have
Yes.
some better history and some better data. We probably now have better data on what was going on then than Hoover
Yeah,
did at the time.
absolutely.
Um, but to have a better explanations for what's going on economically
Hmm.
in a biography of Hoover during this time period would have been, you
Yeah.
know,
Well, and it's hard to
but it's
it's hard for us to remember that their assumptions weren't the same as ours, right? I mean, since the 70s, we associate recession with high inflation, right? Because of what happened during the
yeah,
70s, the whole stagflation thing. But the thing that they were worried about then, especially, again, going back to this agricultural recession, was huge deflation. And and that's something that White probably doesn't really know how to kind of deal with. Because what happens, when you get deflation, right? What happens when you get, I mean, not only of farm prices, not only of the grain, the wheat that they had been shipping to Europe, but then also of the values of farms themselves, right? You get these people who have borrowed to expand their acreage or to build new infrastructure on their farms or to buy new farm equipment, right? And now all of this stuff is now the values of all of these things are also deflated, right? So now everybody's underwater with respect to their mortgage and their equipment loans and everything, right? And they
yeah,
don't have they can't sell as much at the high prices to generate the revenue to pay off these things. So it just and that's why even for a guy who is economically astute like Hoover, I mean, this thing seems to have caught him by surprise. This idea that of course these rural banks are gonna go belly up, right? Because the values of what they loaned this money on have decreased by half. So they can grab it all, right? They can foreclose on everything and they still can't get out of the hole.
yeah. And particularly for a guy who's been in the business of how do you feed the world and what does the agricultural supply chain look like?
Hmm.
He should have been able to say, "Oh yes, we built up this massive sector in the US and exported all of it, and all those exports just stop." You may have a year or two
Well,
that
especially
it
because he was
takes.
partially responsible for the exports.
You should realize it may take a year or two after the war for, those farmlands to come back under agriculture again, but they're going to start making their own food once again. And when they do, you're left literally holding the bag.
Hmm.
And how he didn't, how you don't plan for that after the fact,
Hmm.
you know, or, geez.
And maybe also partially the structure of the industry. I mean, he's a mining guy, right? Metals kind of hold their value, right? I mean, there is an industrial supply chain that these things kind of feed into, and there is, there and it's centralized, right? And there's a limited amount. I mean, it may be highly capitalized, but it's not capitalized over this wide. I mean, they're atomized, kind of population of farmers, right? It's mining companies, right? Like the one that he worked for in England, and then and so they're, I mean, and even nowadays, right? BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto, these are massive global, concerns. And so the risk involved is of a kind of a different sort, I think, which maybe, created a blind spot for him.
Or at least the consumption levels of doing it. You mine metal and it goes into a product that becomes a physical piece of capital for 50 or 100 years is one thing. But when you manufacture foodstuffs, it goes into people's bellies and disappears in, the has a shelf life, and then even after it's eaten, it's gone after that.
Mhm.
So the manufacturing cycles for what that is doing are dramatically different.
Mhm.
And even worse if it's metal that's gone into making a tractor that has a value, but now the thing it was that tractor was being used for disappears. You've had the rug pulled out from under you. Becomes even worse when you've financialized the whole process.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of complexity, I guess, really is the bottom line of this.
I
And so maybe I don't blame, so you don't value manure or soils. No, not really, because because we've replaced manure and soil qualities with first Chilean nitrate, and then Haber-Bosch nitrate.
Yeah.
Neither
Well,
of
but
which you can
that
get from because the strait is the
that's the issue with the Dust Bowl too, is you've got all these agriculturalists coming into a place that has super rich topsoils for a couple of years, and you overstrip it, and you can't put all that back. But then once you've taken off that topsoil, then it just turns to dust and blows away.
Mhm.
That's becomes an issue later.
Yeah.
But we haven't even touched on, and probably should, because I always forget that Hoover is like right in the midst of prohibition,
Mhm.
and what the hell do we do about it? And that seems to be the one big public, like, I was shocking to me, all these states doing drastically different enforcement levels
Yeah.
on what was, and it was, American water essentially. Like, the water was not safe, so we relied on beer, we relied on alcohol as, like, you know, our daily drinking for two
So you
centuries
shouldn't,
almost before.
if your water is anything like it is at Flint, you should be not teetotal, but tea drinkers instead. But you busted that one by being an unreasonable minimal taxpayer.
But then we did. I mean, yes, but there are other alternatives with boiled water. But yeah, so what do we do with this, with all of this politics around prohibition, and the idea that, that maybe, because White kind of talks about it a little bit in the terminology of states' rights as well. That this is something that is, unresolved, right?
Yeah.
What the states, should the states have any type of a say in prohibition at all? And then should they have any leeway in enforcement? I mean, really, the practical measure was really, how would enforcement work?
I mean, that was even he even at the time though that was sort of considered to be weasel words. I mean, they were like, there was him. He wanted, any state could have prohibition before the whatever the heck amendment it was,
Mhm.
and could do it again. I mean, afterwards, there's, if Utah, I mean, I think Utah did actually. Utah was dry, right, for a while. I forget, or maybe it only had state liquor stores, but yeah, a state could, states can enforce their liquor laws however they want. I mean, I think the real issue for the sort of dry versus wet thing and was crime. Was we were building this enormous criminal, enormous incentive and atmosphere of of crime pays and people are if people are making this illegal, then everything's illegal, and who cares about the law? It was a prohibitions. Yeah, I'm sure that was prohibition was popular when it came in. You know, Probably it really was, and I mean, and the whole reason we have an income tax is because the reason we got the income tax amendment passed was because that will allow us to do prohibition, because then we won't have to make all the federal government money off of liquor taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and there was lovely, it's really the immigrants, the Catholics or whoever, who are the drinkers. So you had race, ethnicity, everything that you could to make this really popular, and
Right. So the Klan gets to be a prohibition party.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and
There's also the moralization of the everybody wants to say yes, we should all drink less and
yeah.
be less alcoholic and have less of those influences. So you'll moralize for it, but on an individual level, everybody's still, oh, it's it's bad for everybody else, but for me, I'm still gonna drink.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the problem is that mismatch between the two. Because I remember, and even when you look at where alcohol is now in America, there's weird states like South Carolina. If you go out and buy alcohol, it doesn't come out of it doesn't come out of your big, liquor bottle. You buy it an ounce or an ounce and a half at a time in the tiniest little bottle, and that's what your drink is.
Mm.
Um, but I
Well, in Minnesota,
remember
they have on and off sale. Yeah.
or you get the blue laws and all these states that cover up the alcohol on Sundays,
Mm-hmm.
and you can't buy it on Sundays. Well, who that's when you're drinking it. You bought it Saturday, you know.
Or even
Um,
Hoover. Even Hoover himself he talks about he's like a committed dry, except he also goes and gets cocktails on the regular. That's his
At
thing.
the,
They go
at
to
the embassy,
the embassy, I guess. They go to the embassy to get the cocktails,
But well, and that's the thing. So, and I'll give you an example. When I lived in Georgia growing up in high school, we lived in a dry county,
Mm-hmm.
and because we lived in a dry county, you could not get a good restaurant in town because to have a really good restaurant, you need liquor sales to support
Yep.
the all the other things that make a good restaurant a good restaurant.
Most of the profits from
And
booze, yeah.
so my dad, as a leader of one of the largest businesses in the town, decided I'm tired every week. People come in from out of town for business, and we have to drive 35, 45 minutes away to go to a reasonably good restaurant. And it's
Mm-hmm.
all about the alcohol. So he's like, we're gonna have a referendum in the town to do liquor by drink liquor by the drink
Mm-hmm.
so restaurants can benefit. So he got enough signatures to put it on a referendum. And super religious town, every preacher preached against it. Oh, this is bad, this is horrible. And everybody in town said, "Oh yeah, it is horrible." But it was the biggest landslide vote in the county's history and passed by like 98%, even though everybody publicly said they were against it. No, in practice, nobody was.
Mm-hmm.
But it took about 6 years before restaurants actually came to town to do that and build that business. but it was just the weirdest,
That's
like
the thing. They were probably expecting it to be repealed in the next session.
Yeah.
it was the weirdest, like, oh no, you couldn't repeal it because it was such a massive landslide, it just wasn't even funny.
Hmm.
But the moralizing behind it, everybody, all these religious people saying, oh no, we're not gonna, that's just the devil's juice. But then when you look at the returns at the voting booth, like everybody said one thing, but they did a wholly different thing on the other side. And
Mhm.
it just was shocking to me. But we do, and we're doing that same thing now with things like, abortion. Like the vast majority of people are over here, and like, we're not out to kill people on purpose, but the tiny little minority that is forcing us into this weird hole, if we wrote a referendum and everyone voted on it, the majority of the country would go one way, but
Yeah.
it's this weird moralizing thing that's holding us, to what? I don't know.
Well, and like that, like the abortion issue, it's, it had to be polarized in those absolutes, right? Either none at all or no limits at all,
Yeah.
which is absurd, really, when you think about
But
it.
the watching of building a criminal enterprise on the back of this moralization thing
Hmm.
is the weird part. And I don't know if there are analogies to be drawn to the same the same sorts of things we saw with immigration policy shifting in the 70s,
Yeah.
which, and I think it was the one of the war czars coming out of Vietnam that got put in charge of border security in the 70s, that shifted us going from kind of no policy where a bunch of immigrants came in, picked fruit, and then they all went back.
Hmm.
And then suddenly we kind of closed the border. So you had to make a decision, which side were you going to be on, because you couldn't do
There,
the easy
there,
back and forth economic piece.
there's a really, and there's a sad piece of history there of people forget that Cesar Chavez and the UFW were for, they there was at least a episode there where they were foreclosing the border. They only wanted American, farm workers, working. So
Yeah.
Hmm.
But watching this prohibition thing create criminal enterprise. A lot of the immigration thing is stuck with,
Yeah.
yeah,
and in addition to the animal coyotes I see walking through my neighborhood
yeah.
because of where I live in Los Angeles, there is a whole nother type of coyote who's running people back and forth across the border, and
Hmm.
also dealing, in things in the drug trade back and forth. That the way we handle these issues compounds the crime as a result of that. And I
Hmm.
don't know that we don't frame it almost ever in those senses, other than the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that Trump wants to say, oh,
Right.
all foreigners are criminals and bad people.
Right.
It's just the brown ones, just the brown ones.
Yeah, well,
Well,
but that's the
it's
thing is,
it's funny though, who gets to be considered brown changes over time too, though. But it is, the hypocrisy thing, the idea of, of the kind of the hypocritical nature of this, moral panic, kind of stuff around. I mean, remember, I mean, even in The Godfather Part One, that was one of the, that was one of the ways that Coppola was very deliberate about, and I guess it came from Puzo as well, about making the Don, Don Corleone, kind of sympathetic, because the things, and he even says this to Salazzo and the other people, the things that I'm involved in, liquor and gambling and that kind of stuff. These are vices that everybody, sort of accepts and thinks, and sort of believes that people should be able to choose to do them or not to do them themselves, and narcotics is a whole nother thing, right? And that was where he drew the line. But that idea, I think, goes a long way, right? That some of these things are not, I mean, I think we were joking last week that we got women's suffrage and then we got prohibition. And I'm sure that, that the women who were exercised over the issue of women being beat up and women, and men coming home, with, having drunk their pay at the end of the week, was legitimate, right? But it wasn't something that, I guess, that the rest of the society felt that strongly about.
Yeah. Well, it seemed like Hoover, at least here, was about as wishy-washy on it as everybody else in America seemed to be,
Yeah,
except for the
he was a man of his
hardline
times, at least.
teetotalers. It's like, I'm one of the guys responsible for enforcing this, and you know.
Yeah, right. Yep. Yeah, Tim, I think we're going to finish next. We're not going to get to the end. It doesn't feel like we've got a half hour.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to get through. So we'll need to take a couple weeks off while I'm leaving here, getting to California and kind of getting set up there. But
So was it 2 weeks
2 weeks.
or 3? 2 weeks?
Yeah, I will be back in the third week. So yes, I will not be around on the 23rd and the 30th, and then we will commence once again on June 6th. And having said that, I could do it. I could do it on the 30th. I will be in California. I won't be completely moved in, but I could do it. I could meet on the 30th. You want to meet on the 30th?
Yeah, we can do that.
All right.
Yes.
The real question is, are you going to have time in the midst of all the crazy to actually read and think about the book and,
Yeah, I
process
think I
it?
will, because
He's
because I'll also
driving.
be-
He's
I'll
got
be
I mean,
driving.
audiobook
I know you got the audiobook so you can listen to it, but
Well, that's the
still,
thing. I'll be
there's
driving
the-
33 hours, so I can listen to it, and then I can make, and then I can, read quickly and make notes afterwards. That'll make it easier for me.
The last section is just sort of him
Wrapping up his life. Meeting all
wrapping
the
up
other
his life.
Well,
Complaining.
I'm very curious about that, about how he
Yes,
sort of
as am I.
deals with
Yes, I don't want. I'm
the
belittling it.
backlash.
It's not going to be as dense, though, as this section was very, very dense. There's a huge amount of history there. This is. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I want to agree with you, but I want to flip back to something that, Chris, when you were talking about the fact that there's not a lot of economics in this section, there's also not a lot of numbers. It's not a very. This is a narrative history, not a economic history, or right. I think there's a Keynes book on the list, which I think is twice the size of this, and is because it's about Keynes, mostly economic history.
Yeah.
And so yes, it was dense and certainly a little more meaty, but it's a narrative history, and so it's not. He's not digging into the depths of the causes.
Yeah.
The other thing that I thought was interesting is that he spent a lot of time contrasting Wilson and Hoover in our first early sections, but not as much talking about Roosevelt's history. He just sort of waves around, this patrician guy, fifth cousin, onwards.
Yeah.
And I felt like that might have enriched that section, or this section, somewhat. The tail end, the election portion.
Well, the curious part too is he's got 5 big sections, and section 4 is really his presidency, which in most presidential biographies would be 3/5 or more of the book.
Yeah, like the whole thing.
Like,
Right.
here's the important part. So as a biographer, I'm gonna spend a huge amount of time on this.
I don't think it's the most
But
important part.
he laid that out in the preface that he didn't want to do that.
Which he doesn't do. But here also, Hoover is an odd bird in that other presidents, I guess, spent time in the House or the Senate or doing other things before the presidency. So if you're Robert Caro and you do a 3-part or a 5-part biography of Lyndon Johnson, you have a lot to cover because you
Mhm.
got the Senate years, then you got the presidency and post-presidential fallout, whatever
Yeah.
that's going to be.
Johnson gets there while FDR
But
is.
Hoover serves essentially 5 presidents in addition to himself.
Yeah.
So I would have liked a lot more of the here's what he was doing before he was president and expand on more of that and what's going on in the history around that. And then, 2 sections on when he's president, because having the economic background of what's happening both in Europe as well as in America, the prohibition and the social piece of how he's running politics. Expand on that and then have another section or two after for the
Mhm.
presidents he's dealing with after he's out of office because he's a public servant at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
Sense though that he's sort of, I mean, if I'll read the book on its sort of at face value, and I think the story I don't know if it's the story he's meaning to tell, but the story he is telling is that Hoover's actually fairly ineffective as a president. That he's basically flailing around when he is president. He's really good when he's Secretary of Commerce. He's really good, when he's during World War One, and feeding people. He's a really effective and interesting sort of capitalist resource extractor.
Mhm.
But honestly, I mean, I think
I
he's least good at being a president.
he
And
may be least good at being president. But he may be least good so far at being president, but I'm not wholly convinced because I think White is also making a case that he was doing many good things, and then the bankers wouldn't go along with him, or the bankers cut short their relief aid, and so then the next dip happened, right? So there's a lot of cases where it's like, yes, it was not as effective, but there were these other factors that outside of Hoover's control, where
Excuses.
what
Yeah.
he was doing may have been more effective had it been fully realized. Now, you'd never know. It's a counterfactual.
But one of the
Yeah.
one of the things that interested me was kind of the question of, well, what is the role of the presidency?
he says so though. He says, he specifically says, late in the campaign, talking about what Hoover didn't seem to understand. I don't have the quote exactly there. What Hoover didn't seem to understand was that a large part of the job of president or presidential candidate is to get people to come along with you. I'm paraphrasing, but it
Right.
was basically one or two
It comes with the
sentences.
delegation stuff.
Well, to
No, but then not the. We was talking more about the moving, getting a movement, getting.
Right.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah, leading a movement, but also like actually listening to and responding to a constituency, right? Which isn't in really Hoover's character,
Yeah,
right?
it's
And
not in his
so,
way. Well, and if you compare his early mining material, he's either got a single boss or maybe a small board of directors who oversee him, and he's okay, here you've got the power, go do the thing. He can go do the thing. And or when he
take the
has to
power.
carve out his little fiefdom for food in Europe,
Mhm.
once he's been given the mandate by the powers
Well,
that
a
be,
simple, straightforward
go
task.
do this. He's single-minded and he can go do that.
Mhm.
But then the issue is when he is, and even as a president, he's kind of given a mandate, and he had both the House and the Senate on his side. He doesn't somehow he doesn't bring the constituencies along that he needs, and it's constituency management that's his issue with power and doing the thing that needs to be done.
Yeah, and
And
also
that's where the
it's
shift
not
is.
it's not a task, right? He had a simple task, running the mines, maximize the profit, reduce cost, maximize extraction, and feeding Europe. Okay, effectively get the food to the people and convince anybody that you need to get out of the way, right? the role of the president, he didn't really have. I mean, what does it mean to have a mandate? A mandate to do what?
Yeah.
You know,
So here it is in a nutshell on page 422. Hoover was neither the first nor the last political leader to recognize that his job would have been easier without politics. Congress has always been a circus, and compromise with it has always been to some extent self-defeating, and the increasing complexity of government has long required the best intelligence the nation has on offer. So here's this super intelligent guy who probably could do it or should be able to do the job, but the increasing complexity of all of the moving parts and what government is and what it's doing has outstripped the ability for, one single head to
right,
to manage it all.
right. Well, and I think that what you just quoted, I think, is again White channeling Hoover's understanding of the
Yeah.
situation, right? And I think that it's not inaccurate, but it's not complete either, because I think the other thing about the presidency that Hoover doesn't get is that it isn't ever an objective list of things that he can check off and say, did that, did that, did that.
Yeah, yeah.
That it changes over time, and that it's more, oftentimes it's more about, kind of having a dialogue and and an ongoing dialogue and ongoing communication with the people, and saying, well, what do you mean by that? And then they have to, they kind of have to go back and think about, what do they mean by, we want, prohibition, or we want this, or we want that, we want relief for the poor. Well, what does that mean? What does that entail? Here are some things that you can choose from, and sort of this ongoing set of kind of, and again, and then again, also not everybody agrees, right? And people have different focuses, right? The farmers want farm relief. But then once you get a tariff bill, then all of a sudden you get all these industrial tariffs, protections that everybody who's got a factory in their district is thrown in. And so it's all very subjective. It's all always a kind of a moving target. And this is something that he's just not kind of constitutionally prepared for, I think.
Yeah. Well, when we think of too about usually great presidents are judged as great because of some massive issue that they faced.
Mhm.
You got the Civil War and Lincoln, the Bay of Pigs and Kennedy, those types of things. Or
Mhm.
you have a Reagan versus, the Cold War in Russia.
Mhm.
And that's how you kind of define that greatness. But the weird amorphousness of economic turmoil and strife against somebody who probably was about as well equipped as anyone could have been at the time with the data and the knowledge that was available. He did okay, but he also still, we were in a depression for a decade,
Yeah.
you
But
know. So he gets tagged with being a crappy president because he didn't face, but I
Mhm.
don't know that any other single president who had they been president at that time would have handled it any better.
Well, I think again, it goes back to kind of in my mind, it goes back to what I was questioning about the role of the presidency. It maybe not as much about doing specific things to check problems off of a list in the way that Hoover would have been good at, but instead, the importance is making people feel better about something, making people feel a different way about something, making people
Yeah.
feel that progress has been made, whether or not it in fact has been made. Finding measures, or finding outcomes that conform to a narrative. So I guess my argument is, based on all of this, is that the presidency is not really about getting stuff done. It's about making people feel like stuff has gotten done. And maybe
Yeah.
that also explains FDR in the next
Well,
cycle.
it's also a very American thing that here's a thing, it's a problem, let's fix it. But then the secondary problem after that is, okay, which party are you in? Which direction do you think we should go that makes this a fixable thing for everyone, which is not always the easiest. So when you think about abortion, how do you fix abortion
Right.
for everyone? It's not a doable thing. It's either we get 80% of the people and 20% are left behind.
Mhm.
But Hoover is very much a an American pragmatist. Here's a problem. Let's figure out how to solve it. And he's good at doing that when it's a black and white issue
Mhm.
of,
Yeah.
okay, we can
Well,
do it. It's a
yeah.
mining thing. Let's mine it. Let's do it. It's
Right.
done.
He's
Right.
also good though at getting, well, it gets back to the constituency thing. If he's got to convince 4 or 5 people, this is the right way to do it. 4 or 5, then he can do it. And then he's great. It's like, okay, I've got to have these one-on-one conversations back, with the Kaiser
Mhm.
and Lloyd George and 3 other guys to get them to let me do the thing. He can do that, but he's never able to get a popular support for anything he's trying to do. It's just, even if so that horse trading
Mhm.
and sort of speechifying required.
Mhm.
I mean, like I think one of the examples that kept coming up was the relief for banks, right? And the whole point of the relief for banks is to keep these banks open, but he can't get that last little bit of, and these have to be private. You can't tell the world, hey, I've just given a huge bailout to this bank temporarily, if you're going to try to not have a run on that bank.
Yeah.
So again, he can get, if he's going to get half a dozen people in a room, he can convince them
Mhm.
with I've got these numbers and everything, but he can't do the fundamental job of presidency, which is getting the whole country or the majority of the country to go along with him.
Right. Well,
Well,
also, so go ahead. Go ahead, Chris.
no, he's also working in a time when media does not make that an easy thing. But he's also not working. He seems to be very hands off with Congress when instead he could potentially, and because he's outside the system really, he doesn't have the relationships with a handful of even senior leaders in Congress who could have been those, okay, here are the 5 people, and
Right.
I'll let them both go and evangelize to their brethren in Congress, but also then send them back to their home districts to then sell that thing on my behalf.
Yeah.
But
And he
he's
had kind
doing
of
it
big
in a media,
influences.
he's doing it in a media space that it's pretty much it's all newspapers.
Right.
Radio hasn't really quite come into its own thing, and TV just is non-existent. So he doesn't have those tools to do some of that selling.
Though, I mean, he does have, and this is tradition at the time, it's just he doesn't do much of it until very late. The Okay, I'll get on a train and go to
Mhm.
12 places a day and give the same speech. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt certainly did that, and people before him.
Right. That's what I
Uh,
was going to say. He revered Teddy Roosevelt, who used the bully pulpit effectively.
but and
Yeah.
he went and did these speeches. Hell, he got shot during one of these speeches and just kept doing the speech.
Yeah.
Well, the issue too, and it's highlighted on his day of inaugural,
Mm,
instead of being the social president who wants to go out and do that social work, he
yeah,
says, I'd rather lock myself in my study and taken out the pen and the pencil and the paper and
yeah.
started into the work of the thing
Mhm.
rather than the social, which is where we get the and as I've been going along, I make little notations about how much on the spectrum was Herbert Hoover versus not. And so that one thing, like, oh, I'd rather go to my library and spend the day in the library doing the work
Mhm.
versus going to inaugural balls and glad handing. Like, and I think he said literally he glad handed the 5 people that he had to, and then the rest like hide away.
Right. Right.
And
Well,
that's where he loses
yeah.
all of his constituencies is he doesn't have that tool in his bag.
Well, also, there's a thing with communication style of like, okay, I'm finally going to go out there and campaign. So the first thing he does is he goes to Des Moines and gives a 2 hour, 40,000 word speech. That's how you campaign. You go give a 2 hour long. I mean, Fidel Castro was doing only 2 hours. Yeah, that's insane. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
So, and then the bonus
Well,
army. I want to go back to
Oh,
that,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
oh yeah, okay.
Because he, and I think that White actually again is a little bit channeling Hoover here, where and maybe
Eisenhower's
speaking.
not Eisenhower. It was all MacArthur's fault too. MacArthur specifically didn't do what he said to do.
Well,
Yeah.
not the
I
attack on the
appreciated
bonus
that.
army, but the actually not even the bonus army, but the bonus
Yeah.
the people asking for the bonus earlier on. So
Yeah.
several, I mean, maybe a chapter or more before he talks about MacArthur, he talks about and White actually kind of presents his case that this bonus bill is illegitimate, and these are the people who need who need the money least, and yada yada yada, right? That this is not that this is not the best place to spend the money, and it might bankrupt the government, and and all these reasons, right? So he's got reasons, but he also has like no, it's not only empathy, it's just like political savvy, right? And of course later on when he sicks MacArthur on the actual the Hooverville, he that's shown, you know, and
He
start
says it was. He said they were supposed to gently send them back to Anacostia. That
Not
Eisenhower.
raise the village to save it
right
Yeah,
and
yeah,
kill a
yeah.
couple people, and yeah,
and
so
burn
that's
Anacostia.
yeah, yeah, so
That was all MacArthur. That was all MacArthur's fault,
Right.
not the
yeah.
theory
Well,
of.
Eisenhower was with him.
Yeah,
Yeah, but but this idea, when White actually kind of made that case that this that it is legitimate from Hoover's perspective, that that this is
all
that
those
this is.
newspaper editorials,
I'm sorry.
and all the newspaper editorials were with Hoover, apparently.
Yeah.
At least all
Well,
the ones he
yeah. No,
quotes.
yeah. I mean, I'm talking about
Yeah, 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 yeah.
pre Anacostia Flats. So so that I think that was for me, that was sort of very telling. That idea that this is but he sees this very clearly, apparently, in the way that the way that White is describing it, but he can't communicate it. Right? He can't get on the radio and say, hey, you guys, if we did this, you know, then we wouldn't be able to do this, which again is that role of the presidency sort of thing. And maybe that's only in retrospect, because we see, that a few years later, Roosevelt starts doing that.
Yeah, with the
I mean,
fireside chats and the how to be, but it's how do you be media savvy in a newspaper only environment?
but it's not a newspaper only environment. Radio had its explosion during the 1920s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there was already, radio was all over the place during Hoover's time. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
So it's
I was honestly surprised that he used it as much as he did, because I had always, sort of attached that, I've already said, I guess, to Roosevelt. But maybe it's a different, maybe it's a different, I mean, we use the term, digital native for our kids nowadays. Maybe it's that, level of kind of fluency, that although Hoover does seem to have been an early adopter of a lot of these technologies, you know, maybe he didn't
And he was the first
become
guy on
native.
TV too.
Sorry?
was
Yeah, he
on
was
He
on
TV.
was
TV.
the
Yeah.
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 So he just didn't well, I think it's part of the I'd rather deal with one or two people instead of dozens that
Mhm.
hampers his ability to leverage those media in a way that's useful. Um,
Or at least makes
I
it not natural. I mean, the sense that I get all along, with these things that he sort of comes to late, is that they're not natural, they're not part of his character. And so he learns them, and he does learn them, but he learns them with difficulty. And they are, and it's like an introvert going out in front of a crowd, sort of a thing.
yeah.
It
Well,
takes
he also in his early career when he was trying to keep his financial dealings out of newspapers and destroy copies of things, it was essentially I don't like the newspapers, kind of they're the enemy
Mhm.
and could
Fake
cause
news.
the end of me. So let's stay away from them. In addition to his kind of, quiet, shy, not anti-people stance in some sense.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
or
It's- yeah.
his spectrum abilities.
Well, interesting.
Talking on the
And
radio
also,
should be perfect for that. You're in a room by yourself. I mean, at least then.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but what's worse too is he doesn't, in terms of kind of befriending people in Congress who could help send his message out. Even when he chooses his cabinets, he picks the quieter doers and the let's get things done people rather than the bigger politicians. So
Mhm.
he doesn't have someone within his sphere or circle who can go out and take the idea and sell it
Right.
to
Well,
the
and he
Congress or
despises
sell it
that.
to
I
the
think that
people.
White makes that pretty clear, along the way that he doesn't value that, and so
Yeah,
that
yeah.
so that limits him quite a bit. I think it's interesting that I guess the last thing that I wanted to call out was this passage where he's feeling sorry for Roosevelt. Roosevelt the cripple. He's got and it's taken 4 ballots. And all this and this poor guy. I'm not worried about him at all, and I kind of yeah, interesting.
He just doesn't get the challenge. But again, it seems like the media narrative at the time was, yeah, it'll be easy to beat me. Roosevelt was who
Right.
most people thought that would be the easiest person for him to beat.
Patricia,
Yeah,
yeah.
he was afraid of Smith.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
One of the things that I thought about that isn't highlighted here, particularly after we did uh, kind of American imperialism, he does take the governor of Puerto Rico out of Puerto Rico and puts him in his cabinet, and then puts Roosevelt's nephew or something in the position. But there's no discussion of where he fits into American imperialism as a broader thing,
Hmm.
particularly with respect to all these foreign countries who owe money to the United States
Right.
as a means of control and hegemony over other places. And
And-
I kind of would have liked a little more on that front
So,
because that's some of what's going on here is where we are now.
right. And particularly with respect to having been the devil a couple of chapters
Yeah.
earlier.
was there any actual? I haven't looked in the index. Is there any mention of the Philippines, Cuba, or besides, say, I took the guy out of Puerto Rico in this book? I mean, it is an interesting sort of contrast to these are things that are all happening during his we're actively involved in the Philippines in major ways in Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico during
Right.
this period, and it's not even mentioned.
Yeah.
I
Well,
get
I think the headline is so much the depression and the crash that you lose out on everything else as an option. Like, so it's what is the status quo that America has already put into production, and that
Yeah.
continues apace while he's dealing with all this other stuff.
Right. But he does. I mean, when
Um,
with the first parts of the book, he's very, he's
Yes.
super engaged with Europe. Right. So yeah,
yeah,
what about the global South? What about what about American
yeah.
imperialism? So it does.
Yeah.
It does. I mean,
Well,
And
but that
he's in the midst
isn't
of the
that
Boxer
Immerbar's case?
Rebellion, all of these pieces that are American imperialism that are going on while he is in office and really throughout all of his political career.
mhm.
And not only as president, and I'm curious to see what influence he has on presidents after going even into JFK,
Yeah.
who he turns down as I won't serve in your administration. I'm either too old or too whatever. I don't know what it's going to be. I haven't gotten that far yet, but
Too cranky.
you know, he has influence over decades of presidents after he's out of office.
Right.
And
Right.
that piece just totally is missing. And it's interesting too because a lot of the global downturn is a downturn in parts of Europe before it hits America,
Mhm.
and the level of globalization broadly at the time isn't what it is now, obviously, but it's starting certainly.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
So I think that was kind of a missed opportunity that I'd like to see, would have liked to see a little more of what's going on that front
Yep.
here.
Yep. Okay, so in 2 weeks, on the 30th, we will finish this and we will choose a new book. Or have we already chosen the new book?
We do it in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Well, we hadn't chosen. I thought we were. Well, my thought was we were intended to choose it this week so that we could read ahead when we met with the 2 week break.
Yeah.
All right. What
Or
I
the
do we
feel-
3 week break, I guess technically.
I
Now
feel
it's a
like when
2 week break.
we chose this book, there was some other book on the list that it was like we thought we would do next, but I don't remember what it was.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too.
Yeah, I don't recall.
Let me quick go look. I'll pop over there.
Do you want to do another poll and we
Okay. Yeah.
Like throw the most recent top vote getter kind of things.
Oh, I hadn't opened the vault this morning and it's not opening very fast. So I guess I will figure out what's going on there. Reload the app in restricted mode. That doesn't sound good. Excalibur. Oh, there's an Excalibur. Somebody trying to use Excalibur in there? All right, I'll figure it out. So yeah, it looks like it's opening very slowly. So book suggestions here. We've got community forum.
One issue I've noticed with Obsidian recently is the function called workspaces grows like topsy and then means it's like 8 minutes before my vault opens.
Oh, wow.
And then I take a bunch of the archive files out of a vault, reinstall Obsidian, and then all of a sudden I get, oh, you've got 8 workspaces that are hidden, 3 workspaces that are open, and it's like one file. And I never use workspaces. I don't even have the plugin enabled.
Yeah, I don't either. I
So
don't know what's going on with
I'm going to be dipping into the help forum to see if anybody knows what to do about that. But as soon as I manage to get rid of most of them, so I'm down to, as I say, 8.
that. Okay. Well, we've got. I mean, this is group or iteration number 36, or so maybe at some point maybe this needs to get archived and a fresh instance of it needs to
It might well be that you have to put it somewhere that's not in the vault, reinstall, and then bring it back.
Yeah.
But I tried to grab the Dropbox thing, and then when it opened the zip, it said not a valid zip. So I haven't redone that yet.
Okay.
So I shall do that on Monday or Tuesday.
All right. Well, I will. I'll back this up and then mess around.
See you in 2 weeks.
All right. See you on the.
Have a safe drive, and
Thank you.
try and get rid of all those fentanyl boxes before they realise what's in them.
All right. I don't know what that
Are
is.
you going to be here quick enough to vote? Because voting day is coming soon.
When is it?
Like
How soon, Chris?
like a week and a half.
Oh, I think I won't.
I know I've got to all the debates I think are now over for the big highline things in California. It's like
But if he's going to vote in California,
first
he
week of
needs to be
June, I
white.
think.
He needs to be really white and not have a name that ends in O and register to vote.
Well, I'll have to. I'm going to be arriving on the 29th, and then So I was planning on going and, registering my car and getting a California driver's license that first week of June. So I might squeak in there. I got to get a live scan too, so I can teach
You
it.
didn't hear it from me, but car insurance is way cheaper in Minnesota than it is here. So, don't rush to do that one so quick. But,
Well, yeah, I've heard that, but
make sure you vote.
I do want to establish my residency. So I at least have to get the driver's license thing underway.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So see you in a couple weeks.
That's fine. Okay.